Just a minute.
We are live on YouTube as well.
So City Makers, definitely it's a great platform where different minds have come together. It's an exchange. There is so much to give, so much to learn, so much to take back.
This is a new education system, I believe. We just didn't learn the city, but also we met lots of people from other countries.
I have learned from the city, from the experts. There also have been an intercultural interchange.
Porque conocimos de todo, la parte urbana de las grandes obras, también fuimos a su sector más vulnerable y entendimos sus problemas sociales que también existen acá.
Like a full week of experiences is just like coming to an end now. I think we had a lot of fun, and I think it's just a good experiences for exchanging different cultures and different ideas.
Hemos tenido conferencistas de una calidad superlativa, han hecho mucho hincapié en eso, ¿no? En la diversidad, en la integración, en la capacidad de convivir.
I found it like the 21st new method of learning, where we met a lot of experts and very famous specialists and architects, urban planners.
So City Makers gives you the opportunity to learn from professionals, have face-to-face conversations and discussions about how they are planning cities nowadays. And you also have the opportunity to share experiences with people from all around the world, other city makers, coming here to Barcelona, learning from the city practices here, and then trying to make something in our own cities.
It's a right mix of audience, interacting with the government officials, interacting with the private studios, and how all of them are coming together and making the city making possible.
I am enjoying a lot this City Makers Lab because we'll have different people from different nationalities and we're learning from each other. And as well, we're in the city of Barcelona, which is like the mecca of urbanism.
Como latinoamericano hay muchas cosas que se pueden tomar de acá y que definitivamente son grandes ejemplos para lo que podemos hacer allá.
Hemos logrado visitar muchos lugares de Barcelona y entenderlo desde muchos diferentes puntos de vista. Me ha abierto totalmente la perspectiva del desarrollo urbano y cómo puedo contribuir yo a las ciudades de mi país. Los invito a los futuros City Makers Lab que se estén desarrollando alrededor de todo el mundo, no se van a arrepentir.
Okay, we can start now. We have almost 80 attendees, but for a while, when I make the introduction, we are expecting for almost 400 attendees, okay? So I want to thank you a lot for joining us to this webinar. And I want to say hello on behalf of CityMakers. We are the platform of experts in good city makers, in good city making practices. We have people from all around the world here that send us the registration. We have people from America, from Europe, from Asia, and from Africa. Specifically, let me tell you specifically every country. We have people from Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Honduras, Mexico, Paraguay, Peru, the United States, Uruguay, Venezuela, from Albania, Austria, Bulgaria, Germany, Greece, Italy, Macedonia, the Netherlands, Russia, Spain, Switzerland, Ukraine. We have a lot of people that are watching us from India, from Oman, Qatar, South Korea, Turkey, and finally from South Africa. I want to welcome to our ex-participants from the Barcelona Lab that it happened last year, and I want to thank you so much for being so loyal in terms of being with us in every activity we do. But especially, I want to thank to our speakers, Alper Gasul from the metropolitan area of Barcelona, Diane de Cruz from Goa, India, Anup Naik, and Manuel Morales from the Universidad de Costa Rica. Brian is going to tell you later about the biography of every speaker we have. Thank you so much for joining us and for believing in this idea of streaming this situation that it's going on now. But also, I want to thank the people that's making this possible, because this is our first experience by doing a webinar. So we are not TV people, but we are doing the best. Mainly, I want to thank Victor Torres, who is a co-founder of CityMakers and the director of the Latin American chapter. And I want to thank Priyank from Meraki Studio and CityMakers India, Shandhya, Annabelle, and Samhita. They are from Bangalore, from CityLab Bangalore, and from CityMakers India too. And I want to thank as well to the Institute of Indian Interior Designers and the Institute of Indian Urban Designers. Just let me tell you something. To be here connected with more than 30 countries and such a variety of professionals and city makers from around the world and a lot of backgrounds, that enforces our mission of connecting and acting as a bridge between not only knowledge, but also between praxis, positions, approaches, professional city makers from all over the world. Why we are doing this webinar? It seems that the situation, at least in Europe and Asia, it's getting back to normality. But in America, there is a kind of unexpected situation because things are not going well, especially in some countries. So the quarantine, it's still going on there. But let me tell you some highlights of what we are doing this. The world has changed, things have changed, especially our world during 3 months, and we are not pretty sure what is going to happen afterwards. But this situation, the coronavirus, has locked down the half of the population in the world, which is a very unexpected situation. No one expected this. And it seems that this situation that is going on is giving us like some apocalyptic images, like parks and streets and the cities empty with no people, and there are no cities with no people. People are making the cities, no? But not only the public space has been affected, but also the world economy. It seems that it's falling down, it's falling sharply, and the urban life, it seems that it's not completely recovered. The cities are post, and nobody knows for sure what is going to happen afterwards. This is what we want to listen from our speakers, just the position or the potential approaches to face this situation. No one is sure what to do. No one is completely sure what to do, but maybe seeing and watching and listening to some speakers and to some experts, like the ones that we have here in this webinar, maybe we can have a better perspective of what to do. So I'd like to tell you something about the title we proposed for this webinar. It's about the right to the city. So the right to the city implies as itself to enjoy the city. And being at home is it's not guaranteeing the right to the city. Being in the city, for example, the right to the city is the right to access to these urban services, such as the streets, such as the parks and the rest of the urban services. But we think like the main question now is how to recover that right, because it seems that it was lost during 3 months, and we are not sure if we are going to recover that right from now to the future, right? Or how are we going to recover? But especially, and the expert that we have here in this webinar, it's about the public space, the urban public space, because we are seeing like very weird image of the public space with the social distance, with the measures that the governments are taking to avoid that the people go together. So how the governments are going to manage this situation, especially the local ones, because if we are talking about the urban public space, we are talking about local life, local issues. So as I said before, we are not TV people. This is our first webinar because we are we used to do like on-site things, but now we are getting the opportunity of reaching many people around the world. And Sandia is going to tell you the modality later, but we want you to feel like at home, like we are talking with these experts in our living room. We are not going to present any PowerPoint slides or so on, but we are just going to have a talk with them, with some structure, of course, and with some prompts that we already proposed to them to allow us to have like a wider perspective of the current situation and potential approaches of what to do. So I invite you to get the most of these experts. At the end of the webinar, we are going to open a space for your questions. We are going to pick up some of them because it's not possible to answer every single question because we don't have enough time. But it's like just feel like at home, talking with great experts and take the most out of them. Thank you very much. And I want to listen Priyank now that he is going to give the introduction of the speakers.
Thank you, Camilo, for setting up the stage. It's my pleasure to invite all speakers from all around the world. And I thank all of them to agree on such a short notice to be a participant in this initiative that we are doing. So without further delay, I am just trying to introduce all our speakers present here. I'll start with Albert Gastul. Please excuse me if I am wrong with my pronunciations. Albert Gastul is holding a distinguished position of the Director of Public Space Services in the metropolitan area of Barcelona at the AMB. He started as an architect in 1992, and in 1994 he began collaborating with the architecture study of Jules Navas, where he worked as an associate from 1996 to 1998. Then he started working regularly with Pardaji and Tejidur Associate Architects from 2003 to 2005 with Oscar Amela, and with whom he founded an architecture firm called GAM Architects. From June 2005 to October 2008, he was the Director of Technical Services and Environment of the City Council of Corbera and Llobregat. From October 2008 to May of 2017, he was the head of project and works for public space in the metropolitan area of Barcelona, AMB. And currently he is working as he was working from 2017 to 2019 as the project and public work services coordinator. And currently he is the public space director at the AMB. I welcome Albert to this wonderful webinar. Next is Anup Nayak. He has a long introduction, but we're just like trying to narrow it down. Anup Nayak is the founder and director of Space Matrix Architects and Planners, also Urban Frame Private Limited. He's trained as an architect and a specialized urban designer. He's also currently pursuing his PhD in architecture. His work is an experience of 25 years and has spanned across countries like Morocco, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Kenya, Vietnam, and also widely spread across India. Along with his professional pursuit, he is also an active academician. His professional pursuit has also stitched with affiliations to various government and non-government organizations like the Council of Architecture, IIA, Institute of Urban Designers India, INTAC, IGBC, Institute of Valuers, is a member of the Council of Tall Buildings and Urban Habitats, and also the founder of Responsible Cities Foundation. He has been involved in various award-winning projects ranging from master planning to high-rise buildings, and has been recognized for various awards for his contribution to architecture, urban design, and above all, sustainable built environment in the globe. Next, Dean. I recently met Dean before the pandemic, and we had been working on this wonderful project of 18 June Road. And today, fortunately, the date is also 18 June. So it's wonderful to have Dean on this panel. Dean is the head of the architecture section of the design practice Mosaic, which is based in Goa in India. A graduate in architecture and is actively involved in professional practice as well as academics. He has conducted numerous workshops and seminars on architecture, planning, and environment all across India and the world. His work is supported by Royal Art and Architecture Academy of Stockholm, Oxford Brookes University in UK, and Pratt University in New York for their architectural planning programs in Goa. He is a partner and principal architect at Mosaic Designs, a leading design firm based in Goa involved in urban interventions, architecture, conservation, product, and graphic design. Thank you, Dean, for joining us. We have all the way from Costa Rica, Manuel Morales. Manuel Morales is the coordinator of the City and Territory Laboratory and Public Space Observatory of Costa Rica. Manuel is an architect and a doctor of pedagogy. Laboratory, currently he is working as a teacher and academic coordinator at the School of Architecture of the University of Costa Rica. He is coordinator of the City and Territory Laboratory. And he's a consultant in projects of urban renewal, neighborhood improvement, social and participatory management of community habitat and informal human settlements. Thank you, all of you, for joining us here. I think this introduction was really small as we had to narrow it down, but all of you are extremely distinguished guests, and whatever we learned from you today is something that all of us would love to take away back home. All right, so I hand it over to Sandhya.
Thank you, Priyank, and thank you, Kabilu, for setting the tone. Hello to all the participants from across the world who have joined us today for this webinar. I also have Annabelle Villegas, who will be moderating the session along with me. Just a little background, how we're going to do this is we essentially have 4 prompts that we are going to go through. And each prompt will be answered by our distinguished speakers that we have with us today. The first one, we essentially needed to know what your city did. How did it respond? What were the newer systems that came into place the minute pandemic hit the cities? How did the people react? How did the governance react? What went on? A short little narrative. If you could familiarize with the situations in the city. So I shall ask Albert to go first and tell us about what happened at Barcelona, and then we'll take up the next few cities.
Hello, good afternoon here in Barcelona, and good evening in India, and good morning in South America. Well, my city is Barcelona, of course, but I work for its metropolitan area. It's not one, but 36 municipalities. And these are 2 different realities, because it's not the same to take decisions about the city than to have to agree with actions with 36. So Barcelona has already done some things that I will explain afterwards, but at the metropolitan level, we only have been able to make some plans and agreements. So at the end of April, the Metropolitan Council approved an institutional declaration of commitment to the effects of COVID-19. And that is a document that speaks about the limiting the impact of human action on the environment, and of opting for a model of economic development with new models of production, work, consumption, and mobility that make environmental preservation and recovery compatible with social welfare. So according to this document, we are working on a new net investment plan for the metropolitan area, and also we've worked on a document we've called Agreement for a New Metropolitan Mobility that will be approved very soon. So in order to maintain some control of the pandemic, we are already moving on to the phase of coexistence with virus now in our cities in Spain. This is expected to last at least, I think, about 18 months. And in this time, there will still won't be a vaccine, so people lives will be, but people will have to be normalized. Experts point out that this phase will alternate periods of confinement and flexibility depending on the evolution of the infections. We think that mobility is the channel that allows the development of social life and economic activity, and from my point of view, this is the main aspect we have to deal with, both in short and long term. What this document proposes are the actions to be taken immediately to prevent that private vehicles seize the public space for fear of infection, at the same time that we try to maintain economic activity. This is outlined through 4 axes, of which is approached from different actions that I talked about them afterwards maybe. And these 4 axes are: the first one, an agreement for metropolis with more bicycles and pedestrians, an agreement for the recovery of public transport as an essential service, an agreement for a new mobility in the work environment, and a metropolitan agreement for preservation, clean and healthy air. Barcelona, on the other hand, has taken advantage of the more severe confinement time to modify the use of certain streets. And then there we have seen really some modifications. So using only paint and street furniture, space has been taken from cars to give it to pedestrians, bicycles, and scooters, and for people. On the other hand, some big streets of the city are closed to motorized vehicles during the weekends and holidays. So they are only for people, and people can walk, play, and walk all around the streets, and cars cannot go around this thing. That's more or less what we're living here now.
Thank you, Albert. We'll come back to you for a few more details about it in a bit. Bangalore, a city with about 12.3 million people, 12,000 IT companies, and 37% of working population working in these IT companies. Everything came to a standstill. I would bring in Anup next to tell us about what were the new systems that the government brought in, and how did the city respond to this lockdown? Were they actually welcoming, thinking about all the traffic and everything shifting onto an internet platform? So if you can bring us a few stories and narratives from the city.
Thank you so much. I think if you take Bangalore, might be last week of March or so, is that when this whole issue of the pandemic started becoming louder and louder, and there was a necessity to start looking at how to control this spreading. Very interesting things have happened in the city. Honestly, I think the city was very quick to react and to look at how they could kind of control things from spreading. And in fact, for us, it's in the city we've had close to around 827 cases as of yesterday, and that's not bad for a city which is for more than 10 million people and more. So if you actually look at it, this whole idea of the COVID burden has been among the lowest in this place. But it's about good governance. I would say that the city has been blessed with some real quick thinking governance, which has happened through this process. What they did smartly was to look at contact tracing. So that was one very quick aspect they worked on. To quarantine watch. So they also started looking at managing the quarantine areas, and they kept a tab on that. They looked at tracking new arrivals, because most often that's also a problem when you have a lot of people moving into the city. That happened in the second phase when the lockdown was partially open, and they started tracking new arrivals and to monitor critical patients, because I think the first principle was to look at not allowing this to spread. What the city did was actually to look at, I would say, in 5 big buckets, if you may want to put it. They did tracing and tracking very well. That was a result of very good planning, and they kept the data very transparent. So that was fundamental, because most often, if you take a large country like ours, there were issues of holding back data, testing was not done. But in the case of Bangalore, the data was kept very, very transparent. In fact, when the first case was seen, they went about, actually we were able to link it back to 47 contacts. So the idea of dissipation of this information was really very, very quick. What they did smartly was also, in the initial days, a lot of the government workers at the city municipal spread out and were reaching out to pharmacies. And you know, in India and in Bangalore, you'll find pharmacies in every corner of the street. So they reached out to pharmacies to track down whether people were buying paracetamol or whether they were buying cough-based medication. So there was a feedback which came back into the governance system. I would say they also looked at one policy of saying leaving no case untraced. So what they did was, this is one big mandate they took forward, that the city civic body took upon itself to say that we will work on this mandate of leave no case untraced. And that was very, very critical for us in the earlier days. Then they went on to the testing phase, in which, of course, there are different versions of it. In fact, now, if you take the present condition after our unlocking is what they're calling it, the testing has become lesser. But honestly, from a personal point of view, the testing should have increased at this moment of time. But nevertheless, in the first phase, they did a lot of testing, and positivity rate was as much as 1.2%, which is quite good from the way they started testing and identifying cases. They also did a lot of tech-driven management. What they did was they had apps to track COVID-19 patients. They did a whole app on contact tracing applications. They looked at quarantine watch apps, which helped them to kind of look at quarantine zones and how the individuals were coping around it. They had a Corona Watch app which primarily focused on which highlighted the spots that were contained. Then they looked at real-time data collection, and I think that was fundamental to how they operationalized it well. They also had personalized apps like the Aptamitra app. So it was not about governance at one side. They said the public needs to be part of this process. So the Aptamitra app, you could feed your own information in the sense that it would ask you to assess yourself on regular basis. And of course, now it's become part of the Arogya Setu app. But there's a connection to that. So it was about not the governance side of it. It was also about how public kind of met the situation. And of course, the backbone of all of this was the robust healthcare system. And I think what they kind of connected well were these 5 parameters, I would say today. Of course, now, today we've opened out. There are what we call as containment zones limited to smaller pockets. And that way the reinforcement has been much better. They have all public places, I would say so-called public places, have been opened with caution. So there is a monitoring of these areas. Yeah, the idea of social distancing and the messaging around that has been very, very strong. So in fact, today, if you don't have a face mask, you would be fined in the city. So there is some sense of the stick being used too. So which also is kind of working. I'm not too sure how far it will go, but as a mandate of working, I'm sure that these have kind of stitched things very well. So this, in a nutshell, is what's happening in Bangalore.
Thank you, Anup. We're going to get back to you with some more questions a little later. During these seasons, more than about 6.5 lakh people visit Goa from all over the world. And this culturally very, very rich city almost banks on tourism as one of the key economic generators. Okay. But considering the situation today, we are partially in lockdown or not. I think we should hear from Dean about it. But one thing about Goa is that they are one of the better off cities that have managed the COVID situation. So if I could bring in Dean to elaborate a little more on that. And you're on mute, Dean, I think, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, hi everyone. Actually, I don't know if we've managed it well. We've just been very lucky. We're about 2 months behind everyone. So I'm quite sure we're going to get the numbers up shortly. We're lucky in the sense that we're a rural-urban sort of setup. Goa consists of about 300 villages scattered around, good buffer fields all around, and lots of things to keep us happy. We realized, of course, where we've gone wrong over the years. One is, of course, because of the very high sort of income levels that Goa has compared to other states in India. We've lost our connection with agriculture. In fact, most of our vegetables and foods actually come from outside Goa. They're imported from neighboring states of Maharashtra and Karnataka. And even though we have one of the most fertile fields, our rainfall is possibly one of the highest in India, we've lost our connection with agriculture. And that became extremely evident that with no trucks moving in with food, we had to depend on local food. So people started getting back into agriculture, started growing, because the only crop that we really grow annually is paddy, because it's the easiest thing to do. You just sow it, you plant it, and it grows over the monsoons. Yeah. So we've lost the connection with, with other cereals, with fruits and vegetables, and that started reviving, which was really good to see. So people started moving back into their fields. Tourism, of course, became completely zero. And we suddenly realized that, we've been relying on just one industry to sustain us. And we need to look at an economy that is far more resilient, that's far broader than this one. And besides, of course, tourism has reached well beyond its carrying capacity and has started destroying the environmental and social fabric of the state. So that was actually a relief in a way. So in moving out of the pandemic situation, I think we need to redefine what tourism is meant to do for the state and have something that's lighter footprint, possibly in the lines of Southeast Asia, where people go into areas, sort of village areas, into agricultural areas, learn about farming. The term called agro-tripping, which is really about connecting with the land, connecting with the people. So there's a much greater cultural exchange that takes place through that sort of tourism. So we needed to look at that to really take it off. Luckily in Goa, all of our land is common land, communal land. Most of the land is actually owned by communities which share this land. It's basically agricultural. So we could easily, get this land back into production, creating cooperatives, and also have, village development associations so because one village specializes, say, in a particular type of crop, and another village, another crop. So we have these trades and recreate local economies, because that's the only way we can actually survive. And we realize that we're lucky enough to have this sort of fertile land that can actually deliver this sort of change. During the pandemic, we saw, since Goa is a tourism state, we rely a lot from labor from outside, especially for tourism and also for agriculture. And most of the migrants started, moving away because they realized that there was no job opportunities. So our office actually morphed into a collection and distribution center. We managed to raise money, and so the space was used just to collect food, repacket it, and send it off. So we realized that the humanitarian effort needs to we need to kick in. We need to change our careers in a way for the short time that there is, and actually show a greater deal of empathy to what's happening around us. So that in a nutshell is really what we've been doing as an office. We've also, in our endeavor, I had the Saligaon Institute, which is the village I'm from. And this is, of course, a cultural institute. And we realized that this needs to morph also into an outreach center. So we open it out to people who are selling their food products, from the fields, from their homes. And that became also like an informal market where people could meet at a safe distance and pick up the essentials that they need. So I think it was a time to just pull up your socks, get your act together, and help out in whatever way you could. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, for bringing in some true Goan spirit over there. Just really nice to hear from you. We'll get back to you on some interdependency models that the city did look at during the COVID time. Moving on, the next question I'm going to ask is Manuel. One of the very pivotal things that happened, especially in Costa Rica, was the newer system and emphasis on healthcare. And this made Costa Rica the model place or the model example of adaptability of newer systems. So if you could tell us a little more about what happened in your city and in some responses, key responses to pandemic. Manuel, to you.
Yes, hello, thank you very much. About this issue of public space and the response to pandemics, I want to go back in time for just a minute. because to tell you some short story that explains a lot of our response to the pandemics and its effects on our cities and public spaces. Around the middle of the last century, the health authorities in my country were the main public space policymakers. Urban development authorities were very weak back then, and our public health system has had for decades some of the strongest institutions here. It is a centralized, very powerful and effective system. And their focus of open and public spaces was, of course, back then a hygienistic one, with sanitization as their main priority. So we have historically had a cultural imaginary in which these spaces, both in city centers and neighborhoods, have in some sense an ornamental value, and their administrations, in many cases, still seek to keep them as tidy as possible. This meaning that for many people and authorities, the intensive use and gathering of people, especially young people and teenagers at some hours in the night in these spaces, for example, is almost always under suspicion. So there are still important remains of those times when the grass in the parks was not to be stepped on. And this was all before the pandemic. So one of my main concerns now is that the current narrative and restrictions on the use of public spaces, as justified as they can be right now, will reverberate in the idea that an imposition of harder permanent restrictions and over control is desirable. That is something we are hearing in the actual social narrative. For reasons of security, there has been a tendency to fence many parks and places, for example, in the last years. And now they have been completely shut down for 3 months due to the pandemic. And it's difficult to tell what to expect post-pandemic wise, in part also because very few people are talking about it. They're pressuring the authorities now to open back playgrounds, for example, because the children need to go outside and catch some fresh air. But the level of the public discussion on this matter is still a bit shallow. In the government's schedule, for example, they are even planning to open back temples and religious congregations before they take the yellow tapes off the borders of parks and places. So this is one of the concerns that is related to the matter that our health system has been very successful in containing the virus still to this time, but there are some secondary or collateral effects on our use of public spaces and right to the city that are worrying us in this sense.
Thank you for that, Manuel. I'll bring in Anna next for the second set of prompts, and then probably we'll get in some responsive questions or revisit some of the things that they've said. Is that okay? Anna? Yeah, over to you.
Yes. Thank you, Sandhya. I think taking from what Manuel just said, I'd like to bring you back with a follow-up question, because I think it ties in with what you've already been talking about, how prior restrictions and prior attitudes to how public space was used by the people of Costa Rica, and how that moved into the times of the pandemic and the current dialogue that is going on with what will be in the future. I think I'd like to talk again about San Jose and Costa Rica on the whole, and what according to you, or rather, what does public space mean for the people and for the city? And what are your opinions on the transformation of this sort of public space across Costa Rica? Now, you spoke about what the thoughts were and what happened during the pandemic, but we'd really like to understand the kind of inkling or the feeling of public space in the city for the people. Like, what do the people relate to?
I think we have to approach this matter from different points of views. There is a point of view of the authorities or the people who organize communities or have some kind of leadership in communities and neighborhoods, the local governments and the police corps or security corps that tend to have a very restrictive view of public spaces. So this is a very democratic country. This is a very free country. We don't have a military culture. We don't even have a military. We haven't had one for 70 years now. So this is a very peaceful country. But there is a very high perception of insecurity. And that insecurity is almost always related to public space, even though many of robberies or violent acts occur in private spaces. So there has been a tendency of people to bubble up inside their residences, their office centers, their commercial centers, malls. And this has been transferred in some ways to public spaces. That's why I was talking about the fencing of parks and places. And sometimes at some evening hours, there's a tendency to empty these places, and people, and especially authorities, don't like to see people gathering there. They look activities, night activities at public spaces as something worth of suspicion instead of a desirable thing to activate and dynamize a city and public spaces. And people have, many people in our society have bought on that narrative, thinking that it benefits their personal and citizen security. So there has been this struggle that many of us in the professional and academic sector, especially, we have been struggling to direct a different, an opposite message to the people. That, as Jane Jacobs used to say, eyes on the street, where the best is the best strategy to bring safety and security to public spaces, with the natural use of these spaces as spontaneous emerging uses. It brings back a sense of security through appropriation, identification with these places. So there has been for many decades now this kind of bipolar or dual narratives that have been in struggle in our society. And as I was saying, now with the pandemics and all the current restrictions, we're fearing that one of the restrictive narrative is gaining even more ground for the future to come.
Thank you so much. But I think on the other extreme end or other extremity would be Goa and Barcelona, where I think the beaches, the sidewalks, your plazas are part and heart of the culture. You know, being out at night, being in social gatherings is what is the cultural steam that make these cities. So maybe if I could ask Dean to share his thoughts on what is the meaning of public space to Gund, and since it's known for its beaches, do you think or do you believe that the beaches have now changed their being and become sort of breathing spaces during this pandemic?
Well, I love the beaches now. There's no one over there. I mean, they used to be crowded with, you know, beach shacks and beach beds, and I would avoid going to the beach during the tourism season, and even in the monsoons, it was completely packed. So now with no one over there, we've started going back to the beach and enjoying it in its pristine nature. But I think looking at it more seriously as to how we can really make a difference to public space. If you look at the economics of crisis that's taking place, a lot of people are unable to sort of have a place where they can actually run their business from. A lot of people have lost their jobs. I mean, of course, it's a worldwide situation. But we have a strong agricultural background. We were an agricultural sort of state before tourism came into it. And so people have been used to growing that. Almost every family has a field of their own, but they do not have an outlet. So we're looking at how do we actually create this common space for people to come together and actually have this thing. So I've been working on the concept of actually creating community centers, where basically it's a multi-purpose sort of space where people can have their gatherings, whether it's cultural events or educational events or health care facilities, and also a food court attached to it. So the food court could also be an open market. And open markets have been part of the Goan culture, where there have been weekly markets where people sell their produce in different locations. And so if we can create this very economical platform for people to actually sell their local produce, that's one great way of helping them out, especially in this pandemic. Unfortunately, people look at Goa as this, tourist state, and they forget that people live here as well. And so we've really been inundated by this coastal tourism, and I think tourism needs to be pulled back and made far more sensitive, where we actually bring people into the villages and really connect with the local culture of the place. And I think that happens to a lot of tourist destinations. And it's essential that we look at redefining tourism in the state so that it's truly beneficial to the local population as well.
Okay, thank you, Dean. So we go from one tourist destination to the next. We go to Barcelona, and maybe I'd like to bring in Albert. So like Goa, I think even Barcelona, the people living in Barcelona and the 32 million that visit Barcelona really depend on the public spaces. I think the pandemic has affected, or rather has it affected, the meaning of social and cultural interactions? What are your thoughts on it? Albert, you're muted. Sorry.
Sorry. I was saying that it's evident that public space is the space for social relationship. Children play in the children's areas where their parents speak. Young people meet in public parks to make sports. In Barcelona, people meet in the streets and squares to dance. We make concerts, well, a lot of things. Of course, this crisis has meant the resignation to all these things, as well as the maximum reduction of the use of public space. It's evident that public space has not sense without people, so there is no sense in dimensioning it in terms of minimizing interaction among people. No, I think children has been one of the most affected groups by confinement in Barcelona. Children playgrounds will be open tomorrow, for instance, after 3 months that have been closed. And from today, we can meet up to 20 people in the streets or in houses, not before, but with masks, face masks, and maintaining social distance. The use of parks and gardens and beaches is a good strategy to promote social reconnection and to return to the open air for the entire population in safe conditions. Of course, is the best one, I think. But the problem is that not everybody has a park or a beach near home. No, and I think that with the de-escalation, we've begun to recover public space, but the inequality in urban design has become evident. The quality of public space is more important than ever now, I think. I had never seen so many people at the same time in the parks, and we have no tourists. It's something incredible. And for instance, so the use of parks and gardens, beaches is a good strategy to promote social reconnection, as I said. But I think to balance this inequality that it's being generated, we have to win space on streets. Okay. In Barcelona, we already had an experience that is going on. That I don't know if you know. It's called Superblocks. It's a kind of operation where moving a little the mobility of an area, the city expels cars from that area and gives all these streets to the neighbors. Okay, this is quite easy in Barcelona because of its structure. The Cerdà square form permits to delimitate very well these areas. And I think now this has been more evident than ever. No? We hear about the super blocks, and we know people who live there, and they are very, very happy to enjoy all this public space that 3 years ago was plenty of parked cars or cars going through, and now they have gardens for the children, place to make some sports and things like that. So I think that's the way. That's the way, and that's the thing that's Barcelona is beginning to do again with these tactic things that they have been to do, as I was telling before. No? Only with painting and some street furniture, we are changing the use of the city. This has some problems as well that maybe later I can talk about that. Okay.
Sure, the problems always come with every city. But from the super blocks, coming back to our own very city, Bangalore. Anup, what are your thoughts? Because Bangalore has never been so quiet before. I think this is absolutely unprecedented for us. And from being such a densely packed metropolitan, we have a lot of informal sectors that usually claim our public spaces, like many of our Indian cities. So I just wanted to know your thoughts and what have been the effects during the pandemic, and how has it changed this sort of interaction, especially with the public sector using our public spaces?
It's an interesting question. I think for a city like ours, that's Bangalore, there needs to be now a definition for what is private space and what is public. Because yeah, that's the contestation right today. And what's happened in our cities, we've always survived in islands of excellence. In fact, if you go back to the city itself, it was a planned city way back in the 1560s or so. It was a planned city. Then the city started infilling continuously as it started growing. But the problem is that we always created islands of excellence and pockets of excellence. So it would be gated communities, it would be large campuses, and then there would be some portion of the city would be just left off from a developmental point of view. What this does is that it actually creates contradiction in the city, in the sense of what is my space, what is your space, and what is our space. Now, it is simple that today, if you look at, in Bangalore, we have a very strong system of plotted development. And imagine today that I am in that home and the street by default is my public place. But when you take a gated community, the street is no more a public place for somebody who's on the edge of that gated community. So the claims to the space and the contestations of this will become louder and louder. Because what's going to happen is that the city will say, okay, this is my space, it is secure, and I will not allow anybody to use this. Similarly, you'll have other spaces, which are the streets where most of your life happens, is again going to become neutralized because somebody else is going to say, this is my edge and it is not your edge. So this is where the asymmetry is going to become, I would say, a friction point at some given point in the way the city starts claiming the space. But what's interesting though is what goes beyond that. Now, if you look at classic cases in our city today, we have parks. We are blessed with sizable parks, and then you have smaller parks in residential areas. Now, And you'll be surprised that if you say it is public, but it is still guarded because somebody's gone and put a fence around that and saying that if you have to enter this, it has to be ticketed, you'll be timed, and you'll be monitored within the space. Understandably, yeah, they looked at the idea of securing their edges, but did it become public anymore, or did it become guarded and wanted to be claimed at some point? So there is this whole paradox which the city needs to kind of re-look at, of what is contested, what is owned, and what is neutral. So this asymmetry is something which Bangalore will continue to deal with, and it comes from this big issue of creating these huge islands of excellence. Yeah, great gated communities, great life inside, but when you step out, there is some other paradox which is created. So this duality, this asymmetry is something which we need to start looking at very closely. I think for unlocking or re-looking at what is this idea of new public space for our city, it's an important question for us to answer. You may ask me, do I have an answer right now? No, there are suggestions around it. I'm sure that as we speak forward, we can look at it. But in a classic case, I would say that this idea of isolation and this idea of quarantine, which is not what we as human beings instinctively are, but are we looking at something which we normally will look at, about health, about safety and happiness? I think that's where this whole discussion and the dialogue will spin around. And that's, I'm sure, somewhere it's a awakening call for cities like ours to how we can give back this idea of publicness and this shifting this idea of the paradox and the gated.
Thank you so much, Anup. I think we'll move back to Sandhya. She has some follow-up questions. Sandhya?
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to come back to Anup's point of claim and contest. So we still have unsettling fear from the pandemic, although our public spaces are open. In general, public spaces were supposed to be experiential, interactive, congregational, etc. But I think we have the new normal from the pandemic that's defining our behavior in these public spaces. Do you preempt new typology of public spaces emerging because of this?
Yeah, I think it's going to happen, and it'll happen much quicker than what we've expected. And there will be a new definition for this for sure. And where will it come from? It will come from situations, because we deal with density. Our biggest problem is density today. And how, when you deal with density, what is this new space format which you look at? Are you going to redefine this, this aspect of density? So are you safe and secure in the post-pandemic scenario? So you'll always be looking at this idea of wanting to be healthy and safe. Will there be new distancing parameters, in the sense of spatial construct? So today when we design, or when the city designs itself, it calls itself, if you look at the master plan, it will tell you that you need 10% open space, and it goes on, these numbers go on, but that will be a redefinition. There will be a new thought process for what that space. So might be looking at it in the future, the construct of open space demand. I'm not still calling it public space, but I'm saying that the open space demand will be much larger. It will manifest itself differently. There will be claims. I'm sure that, I'm not saying encroachment, but I'm saying today people will push themselves to claim new spaces, right? So that new definition will happen. If it doesn't happen at the planning level, it will happen by claim. So you will find that there will be new definitions for that. There will be ideas of prospect and refuge, because I think that is fundamental today. And that will be the psychological aspect of space, of the public space today, because at some point you want to observe, and at some point you want to be safe, but you still want to be in the public domain. So our narrative for this idea of prospect and refuge will become paramount in the way we start looking at the new public space, especially in our context, because the densities are much more larger. It will also lead to another very interesting phenomenon of where you disperse your peak usage hours. So today, like might be across the globe, you have time in which these spaces can be used. These will end up becoming 24-hour spaces, but you will have a dispersion of the peak usage parameters. So they will shift around. So it's no more that you want to enter into a park like this is big Central Park. We have like a Lal Bagh in the city that it's not opened at 6 and shuts at 6 in the evening. So it will have different fundamentals to it. It'll also come from a point that cities like ours have huge population which move into it, right? It's unfair to call them migrants because they're part of our they're part of the building mechanism of our city. But when this workforce comes in, what is this next public space? Are we going to relook at this new idea of claiming space? So I'm sure that at that moment of time, the claim to public space will be very different. It will be very distinct. And I'm sure at the mandate at which the city looks at planning, we have to go back and look at the fundamental of this per person space mandate will change dramatically. So it goes back to what Alvin Toffler used to say in his book, Future Shock. You might want to claim terraces tomorrow, which are new public spaces. Terraces might get interconnected to become the next source of public space. So I'm sure these new paradigm shifts will happen. And we're already seeing that happen in our city.
Thank you, Anup, for that. Manuel, I would bring you in next. You've always spoken about participatory planning programs, wherein you engage with public as one of the most important planning tools. Do you think such a procedure would help at a moment like this? And do you also look at typological changes in the public spaces within your city?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear well the last part of your question.
Do you preempt changes in the typology of public spaces in your city as well?
I think yes. In the line of what Anup was saying, I think it is still early to assure what kind of new typology of public spaces will emerge, or how public spaces will be redefined after this pandemic. But I also believe here the cleansing of these spaces is going to be primordial. The social inequalities and asymmetries that this pandemic is making even more evident right now, I think will also manifest on the kind of public spaces we have. There is some kind of paradox in parts of our cities where some of the parts that have the most density in our larger metropolitan areas have the least area of public space and open green areas per inhabitant, and the less densified areas have more public spaces, larger parks, and there's also this tendency to bubble into gated communities that have all these kinds of amenities and collective spaces that are wrongly perceived as the new public spaces that are exclusive to some social classes. And I think this crisis is making this even more evident, and the use of public spaces is going to be of larger, better equipped and better kept public spaces is going to be a bigger necessity for the poorer people or the lower social economic sectors of our societies. And those are the sectors that have the least access to these spaces. Also, I think this connects to a spread tendency to privatize public and collective spaces. The real estate and private developer sector has created a predominant market in which the formerly known public life in cities is now offered indoors and behind private walls. And these new public spaces, in these new public spaces, the offer comes with a conflict-free imagery in line of what Baudrillard used to call hyper-realities or the so-called Disneyland urbanism. So they sell you the idea that you don't really need to interact in authentic open spaces downtown where you can be mugged or approached by all kinds of unknown individuals. When you can drive to a mall or live in a lifestyle center, sort of like Sea Haven in this unpolluted and antiseptic town in the Truman Show movie, and enjoy all of the city's experiences without the conflicts. And of course, all this comes with a price. This is a sub-product of the neoliberal era that has strongly contributed to the social economic segregation of our habitats. And because this market separates society in different bubbles according to people's economic status, the consequent loss of social mixture, I think it adds to the attitude of growing suspicion of the different other, and the avoidance of conflict becomes a priority for many. So large chunks of society are being hammered with the idea that the most you avoid the public spaces, the farther away you'll be from conflict. And as conflict is an inherent part of human nature, and if we lose that, we tend to lose our tolerance, empathy, and our sense of coexistence with others. So I believe public spaces where being where we interact with society in ways this virtuality still cannot offer us. I would hope that all this massive confinement will also have, on the other side, a positive side to it, because now people are being coerced to live in bubbles. And this bubble life is not a self-made choice. So we all may also gain a larger appreciation of the importance and benefits of public spaces in our cities and neighborhoods. That's my hope.
Thank you, Manuel. I think that's a very, very pertinent point that you made, saying that, public spaces but behind private walls. I think it's going from these closed, manicured public spaces. I think I'd like to bring in Albert and talk about, in conclusion to this conversation that we are having as well, just your last few points or takeaways that you have for the people attending. What do you see as the changes? Would there be any changes in your Barcelona 2030 plan for play?
I'm not sure. In fact, I think that it's not much a matter of planning for exceptionality, but as a taking advantage of it. I think that something important that has happened is that some people has discovered that public space can be used in an alternative way. Okay, and this way agrees with the way we think that public space has to be. That's a thing that I think we are working from long in the good way, and this is I think this is going to give us the opportunity of being faster in our ideas. So we've also always defend that public space is for people. That's the first thing. That means that public space might prioritize and facilitate the pedestrian mobility, that must be easily understandable, that must be accessible and safe. The second important thing is that it must be open, free and fluid. So it must be compatible with different users. That is very important. It's what we are seeing now in the streets, okay? And of course, it must be flexible and adaptable to changes and be able to evolve and transform itself for new needs. On the other hand, of course, and it's very important, it must contribute to environmental quality So we are working in this way, and it must tend to be self-reliant and with the minimum consumption of energy and a good management of water and resources. That's essential. And last but not least, it must be functional, durable, and efficient. So we use as less elements as possible, and we take a lot of care on the choice of materials. Well, when we bring this to the city, that is the problem. The problem is not what conception of public space we have, but how we bring this idea to the city, the built city. We cannot destroy the city to make our idea of public space. So what do we have to do that? I already said one thing. This different use of the public space and the streets and squares with superblocks is one idea. This means a change of an idea of mobility in several areas. The second one is nurturing the city through a green infrastructure fabric. We have already done this in two cities in the metropolitan area of Barcelona, in Cornellà and Santa Coloma, and in Cornellà with the project Cornellà Natura that it won the Green Leaf Award last year. So, and in Santa Coloma, we've made a project we've called the Green Comp. It has a comp shape, okay? And in these projects, green infrastructure spreads through the city, creating green habitability, social and safety access, and routes through the urban fabric to connect with the rivers around or the mosaic agroforestal, okay? And the third, and I think most important thing is nothing of this is possible if we wouldn't change our conception of mobility, okay? And this is the most difficult of all the things. But on the other hand, I think that with this situation, many people have discovered the advantages and even the need of a new mobility model. So many people begin to think on changing some routines and think about so far to get a better quality of life. And this is an opportunity that, because I think we all know that if we are not very careful now, cars will take the streets again, and it will be even worse because people is not going to take the public transport for fear of infection. So that's on what we're working with the plan I was talking to you before, to make tactical new bicycle lines, new bus lines, new bus ways, a promotion on the bicycle in all its sense, and giving public services on that way. That's the thing I think.
Albert, I think you've gone on mute again. Sorry.
Sorry, I didn't know what happened. So I think, and this is a very important thing that is further and longer, that it's that we have to get all these further than these tactic interventions, thinking in the city we want, it will be essential to promote proximity, pedestrian transits, and sustainable mobility systems. And leave the transport, the long transport for the public transport for long trips. This means that we have to make the city and the needs of our city nearer to us, okay? So we don't have to move so far to go to work, well, telework is now something that is helping on that. Also, the possibility of flexibility in work times, things like that, okay? All this contributes to a better, less mobility is better mobility. So that's the way. But maybe thinking on something like Carlos Moreno proposed for Paris with the 15-minute city, I think this is a great idea that it's difficult to carry on in big cities, of course, because people is moving very far to work, things like that. So, above all, workers of middle class and things like that. No? But I think that's the idea we had to follow. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have a lot of attendees also giving their opinions about how after this pandemic, the post-pandemic, you know, the public spaces will open up and people are going to be more sensitive and conscious and things like that. So I'd like to close with a final question to Dean, and post which we will open questions from the audience and attendees. Dean, being part of you know, the RMP 2021, which is a few months to go, but it'd be nice if you could throw some light in the distribution of equitable public space across Goa as a whole, maybe taking after what Albert Tervis has been speaking about.
So as you know, the RP 2021 was a participative plan in which we really got inputs from the people. We prepared just a draft sort of a plan which indicated all the eco-sensitive zone, the settlement areas, and we allowed the people to actually give their inputs and of course work with those inputs in creating the plan. But how do you actually educate people in working with a plan which they're not familiar with? So first to understand, you know, what mapping is all about and map their aspirations as well. But also for them to understand what is development. I mean, because for development, people think it's all about, you know, buildings and infrastructures, about roads and things like that. So we defined it as two different types of infrastructure development: the gray, which is of course your buildings, your industry, your roads and factories, whatever, and the green, which is your open space, which is your rivers, your water bodies, your fields, your hills, your orchard areas. And that's essential for life, because all these give you your food, your water, your oxygen. They sequester your carbon dioxide, they take your waste. And we realize that actually it's about 5 times the area of green infrastructure that you need to support gray infrastructure. So it's extremely essential that you actually demarcate 4 or 5 times that area of whatever you want to settle in, because we generally tend to work the other way around. We think development is you make buildings, whatever's left over is your open space. But you first have to find where are you going to get your natural resources from. And those natural resources have to be mapped. And it's only with that you can actually create a sustainable community. And we've seen the failure of cities in this pandemic because they rely completely on the outside world for their water supply, their energy, their food. And the moment that's cut off, you see a crisis situation. So we need to create these small closed loop economies that are ecologically also strong and resilient in order to actually to make them new. And we can duplicate and replicate them to create, it's like any living creature, it's an assemblage of cells. So create resilient cells, and then you can actually build upon them. And if I can just briefly touch on something that makes me angry from a city of my childhood. And when you talk about open space, we really talk about this romantic version of open space. And I've seen some horrid pictures, and you know, in the city of Bombay, where I was born and grew up in, you know, next to this massive race course which has a golf course attached to it is a slum, this extremely dense slum. And you see kids playing at the edge of this, you know, green where people are, you know, playing golf in these massive green areas, and kids are just squashed against this fence. And if you can see the inhuman nature of the distribution of open space in our cities. And Bombay is one city which it's one of the lowest open space indexes in the world. So we need to address this in a very serious manner.
Thank you so much for that. I think it's been quite a whirlwind of comparatives and narratives from across the globe. So we're going to keep the floor open for a few questions from our audience. I think Priyank will come in with these questions to our panelists. Off to you, Priyank. Priyank, you're on mute, sorry.
All right, so if anyone has questions, just try to put it in the Q&A section and not in the chat box, because it will be difficult for us to refer to all the questions in the chat box. So just put it in the Q&A box. It will be right at the bottom of the screen next to record button on your Zoom app. Okay, so there are a few questions. So I'm just going to start taking up a few questions. There is one interesting question from Nora. The question Nora asks is that I think density problem is the biggest challenge in terms of other cities. The idea of super blocks in Barcelona is a good example, But what could you do in cities which don't have super blocks or cities with other type or morphologies? What would we do it in Gothic Quarter, Al Raval, or other neighborhoods of Barcelona which doesn't have super blocks and could be repeated in other parts of Latin America? The public space which is dedicated to car and recreation spaces which are not enough. So just to, I think this question would be best answered by Albert, because it's related to neighborhoods of Barcelona which doesn't have super blocks.
Well, yeah, that's right. In fact, in Barcelona, there have been in the old city big remodelation of the fabric, and there have been demolitions and things like that. So public space have begin to get wider. Okay, we're coming from very, very narrow streets, sometimes 6 meters, things like that. Okay, and there was a plan that made big X's and things so that this is more to get wider spaces. So in these spaces that usually are themselves less crowded by cars, is I mean the idea is easier to implement than in places like the Eixample. I mean the Eixample is third enlargement of Barcelona, that is 20 meters wide streets, one after the other, and crossing and so on, and that are always full of cars. Of course, I said it at the beginning, the typology of this structure helps to make these kind of interventions, but it helps it because you can move cars around that. Okay. The grid is so in order that it's not a problem to get the two streets on the left or on the right to go to the same place. You only have to move cars around. Of course, if this is a kind of complex fabric with not orthogonal streets and things, we have to think before on how mobility is going to be arranged, and then we can solve how we can reach this public space again.
Okay, I think there are a lot of questions, so I'm just going to pick the ones that are visible in my screen. There are a lot of questions from Bharat. Bharat is an architecture student from Costa Rica, so probably Manuel can take this question. His question is that you guys exposed how pandemic is increasing social inequalities and it is restricting public spaces. So he wants to know and talk a little bit more, hear a little bit more from the speakers about these vulnerable spaces. And for example, homeless people in India and Barcelona, what different approach they want to take? How are they solving the problem of social inequality? Manuel?
Yes, going back to what I was saying before, I think that the public space is probably the dimension of the city that better reflects social and political inequalities. And this, there has been a tendency in the last 30, 40 years to strengthen and make even more visible all these inequalities in the physical urban space and in the segregation of the metropolitan territory, especially. So the most obvious way that these inequalities have manifested in public space is, as I was saying, the privatization of the public spaces, or the generation of this idea that the malls, commercial centers, or confined collective spaces behind walls in private condos or urbanizations, these are seen by many as some sort of public spaces. There have been some experiments we have done in the university where we ask especially teenagers or children what their favorite public space is, and they say the mall or the recreational place where they have to pay an entrance to enjoy of all the facilities and amenities. So there is this social perception that is distorted by the market and the way our cities are being configured lately. And I think we have to also take into account that most of the efforts to control this pandemic right now point in a direction that tends to standardize and over-regulate the ways we behave in public spaces. I mean, we can understand the importance of wearing face masks and keeping some physical social distance while the spread of the virus is contained. But many people have been talking about a new normality where some scale of these measures are to be kept permanently, especially in public spaces. And I believe this may pose high risks in terms of losing some gained ground in the way we see these public spaces as much more than the in-betweens of those closed bubbles where we live, work, shop, or study. And just to add something that has been resonating in my mind, I think is very important. I believe the recent spread of civilian protests around the world in public spaces regarding George Floyd's tragic murder is a very interesting phenomenon to be analyzed not only in political and cultural terms, but also in terms of public space and the right to the city. Because I think these large gatherings of angry people who broke quarantines for a very just cause, may I say, and perhaps also being fed up of their confinements, carry very powerful messages about the implications of public spaces and the social political layers they contain. And I really believe it is very important that we take into account those different layers in future policy making and public space design in our urban areas.
Okay, thank you, Manuel. So there are a lot of questions. So what I feel is that if the speakers are okay, there is one question for Dean and one question for Anup specifically. So can we take two questions if everyone's okay? All right, so I'm just going to take one question for Anup first, and then let Dean answer the last question. So this question is by Tarun. Tarun is asking that public spaces are decreasing, and with this, the pandemic and public spaces will get more disciplined. So will the architecture around this public place will also get a different role serving to the public places? How are these public spaces going to affect the architecture around it? So if Anup can take this question.
It's interesting because we'll have to answer that I'm assuming in two phases. In one in which it's already built, right? I'm saying most often we're talking about the built environment, and the others to be built. So I'm thinking there could be two parts to this answer. In the situation, what is already existing with us, I'm sure it will recalibrate. And the reason why I say it will recalibrate is the way we use these spaces itself will change. Now, 2-3 things will happen. One is the streets will have to be redesigned in most cases. That we'll have to look at more space for pedestrians. So what happens then is the dialogue between the architecture or the single built or the built environment with the street definitively will change. Now, that means that in an already built environment, you would claim the space. So I'm sure the way edge conditions or the thresholds of the already built to the new idea of the street, there will be a very interesting negotiation which will happen. So I think that will be one critical aspect of things. Yeah, there will be another aspect of it in the already built environment, is that you will start looking health becoming a critical criteria. So the idea of looking at health in the urban space will become a continuum. So it's immaterial where you're going to place it, in the new or in the old. So you look at health becoming a very key continuum. When we look at it from a point that there is a green field and to be built environment, then I'm sure newer things can be mandated. You look at green space planning, which will become fundamental to things. You might talk about newer ideas of leaf space index. So you might go back and say, yeah, there is this density which we're dealing with. Can I reinterpret this with a leaf space index? So we're offering more leaf space per person in the green space planning. So I'm sure at that level, it will change, and that will start impacting the way the architecture which reacts to this green space. Large public spaces will have to be reimagined. I'm saying they will have to be reimagined as resilient spaces. So what will happen necessarily is, in this idea of creating resilience, you will look at it becoming flexible. You'll actually start looking at it becoming multidimensional, like what Dean was speaking about earlier, that yeah, today this will hold one function, tomorrow it will morph itself to something else. But they will, this continuum of morphing will happen in this larger public space. And it's also going back to a very interesting point of looking at this idea of what you look at as the groundswell. And this is part of all the negotiation which we happen of protest. So today, public spaces will take that role of the groundswell. So you'll actually look at redefining that public edge or the built environment for how groundswells will happen around that. And of course, we can't miss out mobility. There will be a lot of components of mobility and movement which will hold the key. In effect, what it says, this logic of the way state, market, and society will read will all have to be in some form of equilibrium.
I think that question almost triggered this lot of interdependencies of various issues that affect the public space, the city, and the architecture. And it was very well briefly answered by Anup. And we're going to take last question from Kamal. Kamal has a question to Dean. He's saying that, do you think that there will be change in Mumbai apartments due to lack of proper public open spaces? Would the apartments be made accordingly so that they have buffer spaces or public spaces within them?
Yeah, most certainly. I think we're going to see a change in the way we actually design these apartments. I mean, firstly, of course, we see that light and ventilation are critical for health. I mean, we've been living in air-conditioned environments way too often. They consume too much energy, and they're not very healthy to live in. So I think it's going to definitely change the planning. People are going to be working from home, and the common areas within apartments will be increased. But the problem is, what people mentioned earlier, is these gated communities, these, as Anup said, these areas of excellence. And that's a really sad thing in the city, because we're actually creating these little islands which are exclusive for the rich. And we've lost the integrated city. We need to relook at how we can actually break these barriers between cities. If we look at Bombay, what's happening in the slum rehabilitation schemes, 10-story buildings, 10 feet apart, where the incidence of TB has been 400 times the city average. That's criminal. You're actually putting people to death by creating architecture like that. So we are to actually address architecture. It's not just fancy apartments. It's how do we actually treat our poor, because we've been treating them extremely badly. And that's why they're moving away from cities, because they cannot live there and have a decent, dignified life anymore. We need to address this more as architects than just designing for fancy apartments for the rich.
Okay, so I think we're going to end our session here. Before I end, I just want to conclude and give a vote of thanks to everyone who's involved here. So before just leaving, I would like to thank all the speakers here, Albert, Manuel, Anup, and Dean. Also, I would like to thank the respective organizations, AMB Barcelona, Urban Frame, Mosaic. I would like to thank our supporting organizations, IIID Vadodara and Delhi chapter, especially Hemant Sood, Mayur Shah, these people have helped us really well in providing the platform for organizing the webinar. I would like to thank IUTI Karnataka chapter, the University of Costa Rica, and also the team City Makers India and City Makers Global for just like coming together and providing everyone this piece of knowledge which is valuable. And we just had an idea to organize something during this lockdown on a global scale so that all of us can come together, because COVID was a global problem. Public spaces are something that we all can understand. So that's what connected us, and thank you all for coming and sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.